Hello and welcome to the Super Adaptiod analysis. I'm your host, the Mighty MCU Man, and I'm here to talk to you guys about Iron Man 2008. Iron Man 2008 was pretty much the beginning of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It is the I want to say it was the movie that set the groundwork for the rest of the MCU to come. And a lot of what happened in this movie is based off of a lot of the things in the comics, specifically Tales of Suspense issue 39, Tony Stark's or Iron Man's origin for and his first appearance. And speaking of first appearances, we see Christine Everhart in the beginning of the movie. Christine Everhart in Marvel Comics lore was actually working for the Daily Bugle, covering Tony Stark being a Secretary of Defense, possibly in Iron Man issue 75 of 2004. It was a pretty long story, and it did a lot for the character in terms of how he was going to proceed throughout the future. But after that, Tony kind of takes Christine home and he does the whole shebang. And we see that Pepper Potts is there to greet Christine Everhart. And Pepper Potts is in this movie is depicted as his like assistant slash business partner. And what we see from her is very much from what we saw from Tales of Suspense issue 49, where they were fighting the Blizzard. And like I said in my Earth's Mightiest Heroes video, they weren't fighting the original Blizzard. They were fighting the original Blizzard, but they were fighting Jack Frost, was his name. Jack Frost, and Donald Gill is currently Blizzard. But that's neither here nor there, because that was just where she showed up, and that was where that comic book went. And speaking of where the comic book went, we find that Iron Man issue 1 by Warren Ellis, there's a little bit of that going on in this movie, as the sliding time scale is a concept that Marvel Comics has been using for quite some time, where they modernized Tony's origin from pretty much being in Vietnam to being in the Middle East, the Iraq, Afghanistan war, all of that was going on at the time, especially throughout this movie. And we see that Tony actually is, it's kind of the same thing happens. An explosive went off near him, specifically a device of his own making, and it put like shrapnel in his chest, and every time he breathes or does anything, the shrapnel keeps getting closer, so he's got to live in this torturous iron lung in the comics. But like they said back in Extremis, modern medicine caught up with him and they managed to get the shrapnel out. However, in this movie, it's kind of like his beginning, and we see that he forms this arc reactor. Now, the arc reactor is a very interesting thing because this movie does it in a certain way. It's very much inspired by Tales of Suspense issue 39 as how they pretty much do it. Like Ho Yinsen and Tony pretty much form this iron lung, like I said, and they put it on him. Tony's got to live with this, and it's really interesting for his characterization in the 60s as to how he had to deal with it, where in the MCU it feels like he flourishes off of it, like it's something that he doesn't really so much mind anymore. It's a bit of a nuisance, but he's okay with it. We also see instances where the arc reactor is like it's supposed to be like the end all be all. This is like the biggest invention of Tony Stark. The fact that he managed to miniaturize it and put it in his chest, and it's able to keep his heart warm for like generations to come. And because it's such a powerful power source, I hate to do that to you guys, but this was the thing that did it. This was what Tony had in mind, and throughout the movie we do see that this was what led to the plan of Iron Man, and it's really good. They really do the beginning of Iron Man in such a way that it just blows any sort of preconceived notion out of the water. And when you see that this is the most charismatic version of a superhero origin, we see Iron Man. on the very first time on the screen, and you get these emotions running through your head. And it's kind of funny because the same thing kind of happened in the Tales of Suspense issue 39. We see a lot of Tony and Yinsen talking about what's going to happen and how they're going to make the armor, only for Yinsen to pretty much tell Tony, like, oh yeah, this is how everything's going to pretty much go down. And it goes down almost verbatim. Almost. Yinsen pretty much goes and risks his life so Iron Man could have seconds, or Tony Stark could have seconds, to pretty much activate the Iron Man armor. He goes outside, he sacrifices his life. Yinsen dies a pretty, like, brutal death. And it's so bad that the comic even had to kind of just say, bang, he hit the floor. Okay, now let's get him out of here, because that was like the 60s and the Comics Code Authority. I don't even think the Comics Code Authority. No, they were around, but you had to deal with stuff like that, and there's just a lot that goes into this, and I really do appreciate stuff to where we get callbacks to Iron Man, and his first time fighting, or pretty much escaping from the prison he was in. Tony in this is pretty much the same. He's more focused on escaping. He's going to figure it out later. But as he pretty much escapes, in the comics he escapes and he finds Rhodey, and Rhodey helps him out and takes him to like a hospital, and Tony and him pretty much formed a friendship, and then they left. And it's kind of the same thing in the movie, but Rhodey was always his friend, and he was pretty much the government liaison for Tony Stark and Stark Industries. But as Tony gets back to the States, he pretty much announces that he's done making weapons. And he's on this crusade, or this mission, if you will, to pretty much eradicate anybody who has his technology and is using it to hurt people. This idea stems from Armor Wars, which is pretty much Iron Man 225 to 230, 32. And I'm not editing that out. And what he does is that he pretty much, he's going around, he's fighting friend or foe, carrying his technology, his inventions, and he's pretty much putting foot to ass the entire time. Tony is not playing games. Armor Wars is one of those books that I would highly recommend if you want to get into Iron Man. This would be a perfect start, and it would be a good enough place for you to understand Tony's character and why he's so conflicted and where he goes from there. Because throughout the entire event, he was fighting like everybody. Like Firepower was a villain, but then also the Avengers were kind of a thing back then, and the Silver Sentry armor was a thing. This is very evocative of that time, like where the 80s were a thing. And just like the book, Tony builds this super armor, and he goes out and he pretty much takes it to his captors and people who are using his technology in the wrong ways. And when you get more of that, you get more of this sense that Tony really just understands what he has to do. We then transition to him escaping an altercation with the Ten Rings and talking to Rhodey, who made his very first appearance in Iron Man issue 117, but he didn't get a for sure character till much later, and they started characterizing Rhodey as like Iron Man or Tony Stark's best friend. Throughout that point in time, you had this other thing that led into more stuff. Ironmonger specifically, Obadiah Stane, who Ironmonger made his first appearance in Iron Man issue 200, and the fight pretty much went the same way, as they fought all over Stark Industries, over the soul of Stark Industries, if I'm to be correct. But in the comics, Ironmonger kind of compromised Tony. He brought him back to drinking. He stole his company. Everything that happened in that book kind of mirrors the movie in a way. And Iron Man and Ironmonger had this giant fight to where it took place all over the Stark campus, and Iron Man and Obadiah Stane were just butting heads at that point. They were evenly matched. So Obadiah had to take different tactics. He started taking hostages, but he realized at the end of it he was no match for Tony. And then he was like, "Oh well, I'm gonna friggin' rage quit." He blows his own brain out of his skull, and um, later on we get more of Iron Man, as later on Nick Fury tries to get him to pretty much, not Nick Fury, but Shield tries to get Iron Man to say, "Hey, you need to come with us and tell the world that this is the story." But Tony reveals himself like he did in the comics, almost like he did in the comics, because Tony outright says who he is from the get-go, whereas the comics kind of had him reveal it after a number of years disguised as Iron Man. And at the end of the movie, he says, "I am Iron Man," and that couldn't have been a more true statement from Mr. Robert Downey Jr. himself. The This is one of those movies that is very faithful to the source material, and I have to give it that, because it's one of those things that just just blows everything out of the water. And to believe it or not, the movie didn't really have that much of a script, and a lot of it was ad lib. But this is this is Iron Man. If you ever want to read Iron Man, these are the books to really get it started off on it. And I really do wish you guys like this, or rather, I hope you guys like this. And I'll see you guys later with another video. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Super Adaptoid Analysis, and I shall see you guys later.